UFC 205, probably one of the biggest topics in all of sports because of now the main event, which will feature Conor McGregor and Alvarez going toe-to-toe. I thought this fight was almost impossible. We heard rumors that Conor McGregor, his leg was still hurt, so we're going to go out to our UFC insider, Richard Hunter. He is one half of Phone Booth Fight Podcast with Frank Mir. Richard, when you see that McGregor is part of this headline, is there any way that he gets removed for some reason, and I've got my hopes up for nothing?
No, I don't think so. I think Conor McGregor stays on the card. You know, this card has been such a long time coming with the UFC fighting there in your city of Albany, the state capital, for so long to get MMA regulated in the state that they knew that when it did finally happen and when they were finally able to put on a card at Madison Square Garden, they were not only going to go big, they were going to put together arguably the biggest card that's ever taken place in the UFC. I think you can make a solid argument that this is a better card than what we had here in Las Vegas at UFC 200. And because of that, there were really only three possible names to put at the top of this card: Conor McGregor, Ronda Rousey, or George St. Pierre. George St. Pierre is probably going to be coming out of retirement. Seems like a pretty strong probability. But that deal had not quite been worked out yet. Ronda Rousey, we're not sure about when, and some say if she ever comes back. And really the only active name that was available on the roster that would do this part justice at the top of the marquee was Conor McGregor. So I think it had to be him. I think the real question was who was the opponent going to be, because there were a couple of choices there.
Richard Hunter with us right now on 104.5 The Team. So, all right, so I'd get greedy if I said, is there any way Ronda gets added to this, right?
Yeah, but, you know, it's okay to ask. It's okay to dream. I think what will probably happen with Ronda Rousey, I've got a little bit of inside information because I know part of the camp that she trains with here in Las Vegas. I mean, she is working out. She is training. Her boyfriend, Travis Brown, UFC heavyweight fighter, she's in Las Vegas a lot these days, doing part of her training here. So she is being active. But in terms of when she could possibly return to the UFC, I don't know that we're really going to see that happen before the big end of the year card that always takes place here in Las Vegas. This time around, it'll be December 30th. I think that is the earliest possible time you could see her back in the cage, if not sometime in 2017, if she does decide to return.
You bring up the month of December, and that's ironic, because that leads into my next question, that last year, Conor McGregor, that's when he won the featherweight championship, and some outlets, including the USA Today, have criticized the UFC for saying, look, you've got a guy who's got a championship belt in your organization, but he hasn't defended it for close to almost a year now, but you're putting him in these fights with Diaz and Alvarez. Does that matter for the UFC, or they just want to make the most money they can on every pay-per-view?
Well, I think they've got to go with what makes the most financial sense. And now Conor McGregor is a guarantee to blow up your box office. It just is what happens when he's on the card, not only where a live gate is concerned, but also where pay-per-view numbers are concerned. I mean, he's breaking and now holding UFC pay-per-view records that have stood for a very long time before him, and he's bested those. So I think that is the leading indicator with the UFC. Now, as far as him, what you're talking about, being the reigning 145-pound featherweight champion, yet not going and defending that title in quite some time. He's had his pair of fights with Nate Diaz in the meantime up at welterweight, and now, of course, we know that at Madison Square Garden, he will challenge Eddie Alvarez for the 155-pound lightweight title. There's a couple of things at play here. Number one, Conor McGregor is a very big featherweight. He cuts a massive amount of weight to get to 145, so he doesn't particularly enjoy doing that. But I will tell you my own personal conspiracy theory, and I've asked Conor about this directly, and he has not confirmed or denied it to me. But my thought is this. Conor McGregor knows that he is in a very unique position that if he plays out his contract, a couple more fights left on his UFC deal, that he would be not only the most sought-after free agent in MMA, but one of the most sought-after free agents in all of professional sports. He's in a very unique place, guys, that if, let's just say, he were stripped of that featherweight title, let's say he doesn't win the lightweight title at MSG, and let's say he gets stripped of that featherweight title, okay, he can still make huge box office money going and fighting out of his weight class in non-title fights like the pair of fights he's had with Nate Diaz. The UFC has a champions clause, okay, in their contract that if you're their champion in any division and your contract is up and you're a free agent, they can automatically extend you for the same terms so that you don't walk away with your belt. Guys, I actually think in the back of my mind, in the back of Conor McGregor's mind, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world to him financially if he actually wasn't a champion in the UFC when that deal expires, because he's still going to be making the same big money. And then in November, if he wins the lightweight title against Eddie Alvarez, then the worst thing that happens is he's the first ever multi-division reigning champion in the UFC. Either way, it's a win-win for Conor.
Richard Hunter, he's our UFC insider. Follow him on Twitter at Richard Hunter. It's 104.5 The Team. There's no way that Conor McGregor's ego allows him to intentionally lose a fight or not give his best effort, though, correct?
No. I'm not saying he would ever do that. I just think he realizes that, I don't know there's ever, I've talked to the former two-time UFC heavyweight champion, Frank Mir, my co-host you mentioned. I've asked him about this because he's the one who told me about the champions clause. Everybody has it in their deal. And I said, Frank, I don't think there's ever been another instance in the history of the UFC where somebody could have something to gain financially from possibly not being a champion. And he agreed with me on that. No, I think Conor McGregor would be happy to be the reigning simultaneous lightweight and featherweight champion. I think he just realizes that there's a couple of different paths that he could go, win or lose, and either one of them really translates to untold millions for his bank account.
All right, well, let's talk about this other guy, this Eddie Alvarez. I know I see him over fighting in Bellator. I see him win a big fight here in the UFC against Dos Anjos. He calls this a gimme fight against Conor McGregor. He seems more confident than just about anybody other than Diaz who goes up against McGregor. Is he that real of a deal, Richard Hunter?
Well, he is that real of a deal. Now, I don't think he thinks this is a gimme fight. I think when he said that, he was realizing, just like every other fighter has realized in the UFC, that what you need to do is if Conor McGregor is within 20 pounds of where you're fighting, go ahead and call him out, and that's your big payday. So I think that was a little bit of bait to try to get on Conor McGregor's radar. Eddie Alvarez, you're right, though, is a bit of a mystery guest in the UFC. For the longest time, he was really probably the most sought-after free agent outside of the UFC, maybe with the exception of Fedor Emelianenko. He was the Bellator lightweight champion, had some great fights over there with a guy named Michael Chandler, and was involved in some long-term litigation with Bellator because he wanted to come over to the UFC. He was one of the few fighters outside the organization of Ultimate Fighting Championship that Dana White and the Fertittas really wanted and were coveting. And eventually all the litigation was cleared up. They got him over to the UFC and, threw him right to the fire. He lost his first fight to Donald Cowboy Cerrone. No shame there. But, as you guys saw most recently, took that title off of Rafael Dos Anjos in a first-round devastating knockout fashion. So Eddie Alvarez is on the top of his game. He's absolutely the real deal. And he's going to be a very tough challenge for Conor McGregor.
You mentioned Cowboy Cerrone. He's on the undercard for UFC 205. A lot of great fighters. Chris Weidman, Woodley, Miesha Tate. Is there one fight in particular you're most excited about and think actually might steal the show at UFC 205 besides that main event between Alvarez and McGregor?
All right, if you had to look for a sleeper on this card, and you're absolutely right. I mean, this thing is so stacked. You basically, 13 fights, and I would say you have to get down to numbers 14 and 15, 12 and 13 of those 13 fights before you find a fight that couldn't at least headline a UFC Fight Night card on Fox Sports 1. That's how deep and stacked this thing is. But if you're looking for a fight to steal the show, Cowboy Cerrone and Kelvin Gastelum could be a real exciting one. Khabib Nurmagomedov and Michael Johnson, this fight just got made, and Nurmagomedov is a guy who, if it had not been for a series of unfortunate injuries over the last couple of years of his career, might already be the UFC's lightweight champion. He trains out of AKA with the UFC's light heavyweight champion Daniel Cormier and former heavyweight champ Cain Velasquez. Frankie Edgar and Jeremy Stevens, featherweight contender matchup. This could be a real barn burner as well. So those are a couple to keep an eye on that you're right. You probably won't hear a whole lot of talk about because of the fact that Conor McGregor's headlining this thing, and it's one of 3 championship fights that are on this card. But if fans that are listening there in Albany are planning to attend this thing live, or for that matter get it on pay-per-view, I'll just say this: tune in early and do not miss the prelims.
Getting us ready for UFC 205, one half of Phone Booth Fight Podcast with Frank Mir. This is Richard Hunter on 104.5 The Team.
November 12th, I'm already getting excited and jacked up, and Levack and I are sitting there watching the videos of the presser yesterday that fans are getting so excited just to hear some of these fighters speak. And Richard, you're in a unique spot because you've been to some of these press conferences before. Is it as crazy and as exciting being a member of the media being there as it looks when we see the recap of it later on?
Well, yeah, and a lot of times these days it's a full-contact sport. I was at Conor McGregor's last press conference, and I was having to duck Monster Energy drink cans that were being hurled in the David Copperfield Theater at the MGM Grand when trouble broke out between Conor and Nate Diaz's crew. So, yeah, absolutely. And this guy, Conor McGregor, I mean, he knows exactly what he's doing and can really get people fired up for a fight card like, at least in my time of covering MMA, which has now spanned 10 years, I've never seen anything like it.
Richard, before we let you go, I got to ask you now, we're talking about UFC 205. 204 is like a week or two away. Any reason to watch Dan Old Man Henderson against Michael Bisping?
Yeah, this is going to be this is a special occurrence, guys. And it's a very unique set of circumstances. If you don't know the name Dan Henderson, he really is one of the greatest of all time to ever step into any MMA cage. He was a legend in the old Japanese Pride organization. He fought in Strikeforce as well. He defeated Fedor Emelianenko. The only thing that has ever really eluded him in his career has been a UFC title belt. Now, he knocked out Michael Bisping. These two have a history going all the way back to UFC 100, and he knocked him out then, and 104 pay-per-views later, Dan Henderson is still fighting at the ripe old age of 46. And, you know, a lot of special concessions were made for this fight. Bisping is the champ. Normally, you don't see a guy who's ranked so far down on the top 10 of a division as Henderson is, leapfrog a bunch of other guys to get a title shot. But the reason he's getting it is for one reason and one reason only, and that is because he is Dan Henderson, and he's an all-time fan favorite. He claims, guys, that win or lose, he retires after this fight. Even if he wins that middleweight title, he will just retire with the belt, and then we'll have a fight for a vacant UFC middleweight title. But in terms of just, and he's got a real chance here, but in terms of just sentimental value, this is going to be one of the more special moments, I think, that you could ever see in the UFC. Plus, on a personal level, guys, he is the only fighter on the UFC roster that is older than me and not by much. So I want this guy to stick around. You know what I'm saying? Win one for the old guy.
Richard, we'll get you out of here on this. It's a New York fight, New York City, November 12th. What's it going to take to get you out here on the East Coast and attend the event?
Not much. Just approval of a press credential, which the UFC is always kind enough to do for me. So I would imagine that will be happening because this really will be. You know, I looked at that UFC 200 card and I thought, oh my gosh, you know, how are we ever going to be able to top this? And as I put these two side by side, I'm about tempted to say that this is actually top to bottom a better card than what was offered for the UFC's bicentennial. So you guys there in Albany and New York City and the whole state, really, you're very lucky here.
He's Richard Hunter, and he is just guaranteed. Goz and I is going to take us to UFC the big fight at 205.
We're working on getting there too. Hopefully, we bump into him on the East Coast. We're going to love that.
Let's go.
I love it. All right, you got to check out Phone Booth Fight Podcast. Richard Hunter, you're our man. We always go to you when we have UFC questions. We appreciate you, brother.
Always enjoy going on with you guys. Talk to you soon.